This short video is an introduction to the life and the ideas of John Stuart Mill, key thinker number 3 for liberalism, paper 3, political ideas. If you've watched the previous videos on John Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft, you'll already be aware that we'll start by looking at John Stuart Mill's life and his outlook, before then moving on to how he views those 4 key concepts for the course: human nature, the state, society, and the economy. There's a very terrible picture on the bottom left-hand corner, and that is because I always point students towards the textbook reference, which describes John Stuart Mill as the bridge between classical liberal thought and modern liberal thought. Because for some classical and neoliberals, modern liberalism is a sellout to socialism. Without Mill and his development of the ideas of classical liberalism, we wouldn't get modern liberalism in the form that it takes today. So John Stuart Mill was an MP, but he's best known as one of England's greatest philosophers, and he has many works through his life. The one that we're concerned with is on liberty. And this is the work that essentially sets out the position of Mill as a transitional liberal. And that is this idea of Mill as the bridge, that transition from classical to modern liberal thought. So Mill would be described as a utilitarian when it comes to his philosophy, and utilitarians believe in providing the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. And so when we apply that to Mill's political thought, we can see how Mill is beginning to not just protect the liberty of the individual, but see how that can be maximised throughout society. As I said before, Mill was an MP and was very progressive for his time. He was fully committed to representative democracy. He believed in extending the franchise to the educated, and believed that those with a university education should have 2 votes. And despite me calling him a progressive for his time, in a modern context we'd consider that elitist thinking. But one way in which Mill was particularly radical is in the mid-19th century. He was submitting private members' bills to Parliament requiring suffrage for women. And so he was campaigning for female suffrage decades before it was eventually granted in the first 20 or 30 years of the 20th century. And if we think of Locke and the context of the English Civil War, and Wollstonecraft in the context of the French Revolution, the important background that you need to know for Mill is that he is living during the Industrial Revolution, this great period of economic change, some significant wealth expansion, particularly to those working in industry. However, there is also some radical social changes as well. We see towns popping up and their populations increasing rapidly in a very short space of time. With that becomes poor working conditions, poor housing, and abject, and in inverted commas, new poverty. And so Mill is starting to see that the industrial economy has its drawbacks, and unfettered capitalism, a complete free market, can have negative consequences, such as what the emerging working class were experiencing during the Industrial Revolution. So now we're going to talk about how Mill views our 4 key concepts, starting with human nature. And Mill shares that optimistic view of humanity, but he also is fully committed to individualism. He once famously said, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign." He was fully committed to allowing the individual to pursue their own destiny and fulfill their own potential. And for Mill, and this will link to his ideas of the state, He is largely in agreement with Locke and the concept of negative liberty, that freedom is an absence of restraint. But Mill adds a very important caveat. Mill identifies that there are two types of action that an individual can take: a self-regarding action and an other-regarding action. And so, in the case of Mill, the government, the state, has no right and no role to interfere in a self-regarding action. So, a self-regarding action would be one's religious beliefs. Mill would advocate that the state should play absolutely no role in establishing a religion, or certainly enforcing a religious belief upon the population. That an individual's relationship with their God, or a lack of faith, is not the state's business. However, an other regarded action can be identified as something that the state can intervene in if it is intended to or likely to cause harm to others. So if we had a landlord who was deciding that in the name of profit they were going to move two families into every property and charge them the same level of rent, there's a housing shortage, there's a high demand for property, because that action is deliberately intended to negatively impact those renting that property, Mill would argue that the state has a responsibility to intervene, because what an individual has done there is, in pursuing selfish interest, and rationally a business person should pursue more profit, but in selfishly pursuing that profit, if their actions are likely to cause harm to another individual, the state should and must intervene to ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, I've mentioned the state a lot here, and you'll probably hear some repetition when we move on to it in just a moment. But finally, when we come to Mill, another key aspect is developmental individualism. So for Locke and for Wollstonecraft, rationalism was an end in itself. Human beings, to various extents, were capable of rational thought. For Mill, developmental individualism is that human beings are consistently striving to be better, to be more perfect, to improve. So for Mill, human nature wasn't fixed, it was constantly progressing. So we'll very quickly recap the role of the state as Mill saw it. Now remember that Mill is generally wedded to the idea of negative liberty, with the exception of the harm principle, when an other regarding action is intended to or likely to cause harm to another. And linked to his ideas of toleration, the state has no right to intervene in any view if it is not to cause harm to others. And one thing that we start to see with Mill, and this is completely unsurprising because he was a Member of Parliament, is that the Liberals of Mill's age and onwards become fully committed to representative democracy, that the best way for individuals and society on the whole's views to be effectively represented was through a local representative. If we go back through the course, Locke believed that government by consent could be provided by a monarch, as long as natural laws and rights were respected. Wollstonecraft is moving away from that and advocating for republicanism. And it's really when we get to sort of this stage, transitional liberalism onwards, where there is a firm commitment to representative democracy. And as I said, that shouldn't be surprising because Mill himself was a Member of Parliament. Moving on to society now. For Mill, the key aim of any society was to promote individualism, which at its essence is essentially what every liberal believes. Now, they may have different ways of attaining it, but that was Mill's goal. And linked to Locke's idea of foundational equality, Mill believed that human beings and society as a whole were freedom-seeking. We sought to maximise our potential and our liberty. And there are three reasons for that Mill identifies. So the three reasons why we seek freedom. Number one, We all have our own individual talents and personality and desires. We all have our own, what we perceive to be our own destinies that we wish to fulfill. Secondly, rational individuals pursue that self-interest. We want to realise that potential that we see in ourselves. We want to realise that destiny that we set out for ourselves. And by doing that, by setting out and sort of chasing our ego, as it were, we become self-dependent, self-reliant, and that is what Mill believes, something that we wish to achieve as individuals within that society. I just want to touch a little bit more now on the concept of toleration, because we mentioned it with human nature and self-regarding actions, that Mill believed that it was not the state's role to involve itself in matters of an individual's religion, for example. But Mill was committed to the toleration of a diverse range of beliefs. For Mill, good ideas, good concepts stand the test of time. If anything, when they are challenged, they are improved. And that's something that I speak to students about all the time as a politics teacher. When I play devil's advocate and challenge your worldview, the aim of that isn't to change how you view the world, but to see if your view of the world stands up to scrutiny. So for Mill, good ideas, when they are challenged, they are sharpened, they get better, they improve, and bad ideas fall by the wayside. So let us take a common day ignorance such as racism. For Mill, if we allow those views into the public sphere to be scrutinised, to be challenged, when they are not based in evidence and rational thinking, those ideas fall by the wayside, because individuals and wider society will see that it is not a useful idea based in rational thinking, and those ideas will fall away. Finally, we'll talk about Mill and the economy. Now, Mill seems to become more radical when it comes to his view of the economy over time, and he's generally committed to the free market, but as time goes on, he begins to identify circumstances where state intervention may be required. As I said, Mill lived through the age of the Industrial Revolution and the abject poverty, poor housing conditions, poor healthcare, lack of education that the emerging working class was living with. And so for Mill, he began to see circumstances where the government may intervene. At a basic level, that would include a regulation of employment hours, and actually legislation like the Factory Acts were brought in and designed to do that. They were designed to limit the hours in a working day, for example, or place limitations on child labour in the factories. And he was supportive of legislation such as that. And he also, in his later years, began to advocate for an inheritance tax. Now, that is something that is quite a radical shift from classical liberalism, because property that is inherited, it is an individual's right to do with their private property what they want. It's up to them what they do and whether they pass their private property on. And here's Mill, a transitional liberal, saying that an inheritance could be taxed in order to fund government intervention into the life of the individual. Now, this is not quite on the scale that we're going to see with modern liberalism, but it is the first steps towards advocating a positive liberty and an enabling state. In the time of Mill and the ideas of Mill, we're not there yet, but we're taking the first steps towards it.